Welcome to the Somali Nexus Channel, your gateway to Somali history, culture, and heritage. Today, this episode, we uncover the remarkable story of the Adal Sultanate, a powerful empire of trade, warfare, and intellectual brilliance. At its peak, it was led by great rulers like Sultan Sa'ad ad-Din II, who fiercely defended his people, and the legendary Imam Ahmed Gure, whose military campaigns shook the region. From the bustling ports of Zayla to the historic city of Harar, the Adal dynasty shaped the destiny of the Horn of Africa, challenging empires and leaving a legacy that still resonates today. Join us as we dive into this forgotten chapter of Somali history, only on Somali Nexus. All right, welcome to another deep dive with us.
Yeah, excited for this one.
Yeah, this one I think is going to be really interesting. I personally have not done a whole lot of research or reading or anything about this, and that's always the best for me, is when I can go in kind of fresh.
Yeah, totally.
And so today we're going to be talking about the Adal Sultanate, which was a medieval Muslim empire that flourished in the Horn of Africa. And it was around from about 1415 to 1577.
Yeah, really fascinating, influential empire. And yeah, the sources you send are great. They really cover a lot of ground.
Yeah.
Everything from the origins of the Sultanate, how it rose to prominence, all the way to, the peak of its power under Ahmad al-Ghazi, and then eventually its decline.
Right.
But its legacy is still felt today across a huge swath of, modern day Somalia, Ethiopia, Djibouti, and Eritrea.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big chunk of Africa there. So, and for you, the listener, we're going to do what we always do, which is kind of distill this down to the most important and interesting and maybe even surprising parts.
Absolutely.
Because I know a lot of you are busy. You don't have time to read, long monastic chronicles or books. So we want to give you the aha moments,
Yeah, the need to know.
Yeah, exactly. So the sources we have for this one is pretty cool because we have like some extracts from the Compendium of History that give us a nice structured overview of the history of the Sultanate. But then we also have like this really good sort of comprehensive historical overview that kind of gives us like a narrative.
Yeah, that's great. So we've got like the structure and the framework and then the story.
Exactly.
Really brings it to life.
So our mission for today on this deep dive is to kind of try to understand like what made this empire so influential in the Horn of Africa. How did they interact with like the Ethiopian empire, other regional power, and really what kind of impact did they leave behind that we can still see today? So let's start like at the beginning, like where did this sultanate come from?
Well, it's really interesting actually, because the Adal Sultanate, it's kind of emerged from the decline of another sultanate, the Ifat Sultanate, in the late 14th century.
Okay.
And the Ifat Sultanate, they had been, a significant power in their own right, but they were facing a lot of pressure from the Christian Ethiopian Empire.
Right.
So as their power waned, the Adal Sultanate kind of started to coalesce.
So the Adal Sultanate is kind of filling a power vacuum left by...
In a way, yeah.
Okay.
They saw an opportunity, they took it.
Interesting. And so geographically, where are we talking?
So the Sultanate was initially centered in Zila, which is a coastal town, and it had this really strategic location right at the intersection of all these major Red Sea trade routes.
Gotcha.
So it quickly became like this vital commercial hub connecting East Africa with the Middle East, India, even as far as China.
Wow.
So you can imagine, Zila was just buzzing.
Yeah. Like a really cosmopolitan port city.
Yeah.
So what were they trading? Like what were the hot items?
Well, I mean, pretty much anything you can think of, but we know they were trading gold, which was obviously a big one. Ivory, spices, frankincense, which was, super important for religious purposes. and also just, for scent.
Of course, yeah.
They were trading textiles. And then unfortunately, also the slave trade was a big part of the economy back then.
Yeah.
So you had all of this happening in Xyla. It brought a ton of economic prosperity, but it also led to a lot of cultural exchange. And, Xyla became this real melting pot of different cultures and ideas.
Okay, so they're in this really, really good strategic location now. How did they get their name, Adala? It seems like there's a bit of mystery surrounding the origin of that name.
Yeah, there are a few theories floating around.
Okay.
One theory is that it's actually an abbreviation of Havilah, which is a region that's mentioned in the Bible and also has some, ancient geographical significance. Another theory links it to some earlier figures in the region like Adal or Abdul, who was an 11th century emir of Harar.
Okay.
And then we've also got a 13th century reference from the Arab geographer al-Damashqi, and he actually refers to Zela by its Somali name, which is Aldal. And that's actually still the name of a region in Somaliland today.
Oh, that's fascinating.
So you can see the name itself has all these layers of history woven into it.
Yeah. Now, was there another name that the locals use, like maybe something a little less formal than the Adal Sultanate?
Yeah, so it's interesting because among the local Muslims, the empire was actually known as Bar Sa'ad ad-Din, which translates to the country of Sa'ad ad-Din.
Okay.
And this was in reference to Sultan Sa'ad ad-Din II, who was a key figure. He was killed in Zayla while he was fighting the Ethiopian Emperor Dawit I.
Okay.
And it's got they named the country after him.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, it shows the impact he had.
Right. Okay. So we've got this new sultanate, the Adal Sultanate, rising from the ashes of the Ifat Sultanate in this strategically vital port of Zayla, taking advantage of all this trade. So what happens next? How do they start to grow their influence beyond just this coastal city?
Well, the story really takes off in 1415 when Sabr ad-Din III, he's the eldest son of that sultan we just talked about, Sultan Sa'ad ad-Din II. He returns from exile in Yemen.
Okay.
But he doesn't just come back quietly. He comes back with a purpose.
Right.
He proclaims himself King of Adal, and he makes a really strategic decision to move the capital inland to a place called Dekar.
Okay. So this is kind of the beginning of their expansion.
Absolutely. It was a real statement of intent.
Yeah.
We're here and we're not going anywhere.
Right.
And it wasn't all talk either. Him and his brothers, they defeat an Ethiopian army pretty decisively.
Wow.
And after this victory, Sabr ad-Din III, he orders his forces to continue the war against the Christian Ethiopians.
So they're really taking the fight to them.
Yeah, they're going on the offensive. And this eventually leads to the death of the Ethiopian Emperor Tuodros I.
Wow.
So you can imagine the impact that had. I mean, that must have really shaken the Ethiopian Empire.
Yeah.
And it shifted the balance of power in the region.
That's a big deal.
It is. So they went from, kind of being on the back foot to really challenging a major power in the area.
Right. So it's not just about defending their own territory anymore. They're actually going after their rivals.
Exactly.
That's what happens after Tuwadros the first.
Well, Sabr ad-Din III's successor, it's his brother Mansur ad-Din. And he really upped the ante. I mean, he launches a full-blown invasion of the Solomonic Empire's capital.
Wow.
And according to some accounts, he even kills Emperor Dawit I.
Oh.
And then on top of that, he besieges this massive Ethiopian army for 2 months.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, it's a pretty big deal. And in the end, he manages to secure a truce that's super favorable to Adal.
So they're really asserting their dominance.
They are. And this period, this is when Adal really solidifies its position as this major center of Muslim resistance in the Horn of Africa.
Okay, so they're taking territory, they're winning battles, they're making deals that are favorable to them.
That's right. And historical accounts tell us that at this point, Adal was governing all of the former Ifat territory, and they'd even expanded eastwards all the way to Cape Gardafui.
So they're growing rapidly in both size and power.
They are.
But it sounds like this period of expansion wasn't without its setbacks, right?
Unfortunately not. I mean, Mansur and his brother Muhammad, they eventually get captured in battle by the Solomonic forces.
Oh, no.
But Adal, it's a resistance-resilient state. It doesn't just crumble. So Mansur is succeeded by his youngest brother, Jamal ad-Din II. And he's another strong leader. He reorganizes the military, and he manages to achieve some pretty significant victories against the new emperor Yeshak I.
Wow.
He even manages to push as far as the Blue Nile region.
So that's deep into Ethiopian territory.
It is. They were a force to be reckoned with, that's for sure.
So it sounds like it was a golden age for Adal.
Yeah, you could say that. But it's also a time of internal instability as well.
Okay.
Because Jamal ad-Din II, he ends up being assassinated.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's a bit of a pattern, unfortunately, with these Adal sultans.
Yeah, it seems like a dangerous job.
Yeah, it does. But even with all this turmoil, the ambition to expand, it didn't die with Jamal.
So who took over after him?
So next we have Badle ibn Sa'ad ad-Din, and he continues these campaigns. He even manages to reconquer Bali, which was a strategically important region. And he starts making plans for this major offensive, this big push into the Ethiopian highlands.
So even though they have these internal power struggles, they're still like laser focused on expanding their territory. And
yeah, it seems like expansion was a core part of their strategy, like almost an existential need to keep pushing outwards.
interesting.
But unfortunately for Badle, his plans for this big offensive, they don't really pan out.
Oh, what happened?
Well, he's defeated and killed at the Battle of Gamit.
Oh, no.
Yeah. The Ethiopian emperor, Zara Yacob, he was a formidable opponent.
So this is a major setback for it all.
It is.
Yeah.
So after Bedle's death, his successor, Muhammad ibn Bedle, he makes the difficult decision to submit to the Ethiopian empire and pay tribute.
So he's basically saying, okay, you win. We'll pay you to leave us alone.
Yeah, pretty much. And you can understand why he did it. They'd suffered a major defeat. They were vulnerable.
Right.
But this decision, it doesn't go over well with everyone, especially the emirs, who are the powerful provincial governors.
Right. They're basically the regional power brokers.
Exactly. They saw it as a betrayal, and they felt like Muhammad had given up too easily.
So this kind of creates a rift within the Adal Sultanate.
Yeah, it does. And it comes to a head in 1471 when Emir Usman of Harar, he seizes power.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he's a powerful figure, and he essentially takes control of the Sultanate.
Okay. So this marks a turning point in their history.
It does. It does. From this point on, the emirs, especially those based in Harar, they have a lot more influence.
Okay.
One historian even argues that, the Adal sultans, from this point on, they've essentially lost control to the Harari aristocracy.
Oh, wow. That's a huge shift in power dynamics.
It is. It is. So we've seen this incredible rise of Adal, periods of incredible military success, but also these internal power struggles and this gradual shift in power away from the sultans and towards the emirs.
Right. And this sets the stage for the arrival of a really key figure in Adal's history, Ahmed Ibrahim al-Ghazi.
Yeah, absolutely. He's probably the most famous Adal leader, and he's often just referred to as Ahmad Garay or Ahmad the left-handed.
Okay.
And he comes onto the scene in the early 16th century, and he's a charismatic leader who really emphasizes Islamic unity. And, he wants to bring all the Muslims in the region together under his banner. And,
Right.
but he's not just a religious figurehead. He's also a brilliant military strategist, and he completely revamps the adult military.
Okay, so he's kind of like a spiritual leader and a military leader all rolled into one.
Exactly.
Interesting. And what kind of reforms did he implement in the military?
Well, he introduced firearms, which was obviously a game changer at the time,
Right.
and he started using new tactics, probably inspired by his Ottoman allies.
Oh, so they had connections with the Ottomans?
Yeah, the Ottomans were a rising power at this time, and they were eager to expand their influence in the region.
Gotcha.
So they provided Ahmed Garay with, weapons training, even some troops.
Okay, so that makes sense. So this modernization of the military, that must have given Adal a huge advantage over their rivals.
It did. And this really sets the stage for the big showdown with the Ethiopian Empire, which is known as the Ethiopian Adal War.
Okay, so this is where things really heat up.
Absolutely. This war, it lasted from 1529 to 1543. So it was a long and brutal conflict.
Wow, 14 years.
Yeah, it was a real clash of titans, And in the early stages of the war, Imam Gure, he leads Adal to some pretty stunning victories.
So they're really taking it to the Ethiopians.
They are. They captured some key cities and regions, and they really put the Ethiopian Empire on the back foot.
Okay.
Now, during this period, the capital of Adal had actually already been moved to Harar. This happened back around 1520 under Sultan Abubakar ibn Muhammad.
Right.
But it's really under Ahmad Garay that Harar, it becomes this major religious and cultural center, for the entire region.
It becomes kind of like the heart of the Sultanate.
Yeah, exactly. And scholars and merchants and artists, they all flocked to Harar, and it became really vibrant hub of Islamic learning and culture.
That's awesome. So at their peak, how much territory did they control?
Well, at its height, the Adal Sultanate controlled this huge swath of land from the coast, from Zayla in the north all the way down to Massawa in the south.
Okay.
And then it extended deep inland all the way up into the Abyssinian highlands.
Wow. That's a massive area.
It is. And they weren't just interested in conquering land. They also wanted to spread Islam in the conquered territories.
Right.
Now, according to the sources, there was widespread conversion to Islam, in the areas they conquered. But it's important to remember that, some of these conversions might have been more out of necessity than the genuine belief.
Sure. I mean, if you're suddenly living under a new ruler who has a different religion, you might feel pressured to convert.
Exactly. And, in the core Ethiopian regions like Beth Amhara and Tigray, there was still a lot of resistance to Islam.
Okay.
And we even have an account of 2 Amhara chiefs who were executed for refusing to convert to Islam.
Oh, wow.
So you can see how religion played this really important role in the conflict. It wasn't just about land or power. It was also about faith.
Right. So this is a very religiously charged conflict. Now, the Ethiopian emperors, they must have been getting pretty desperate at this point.
Yeah, I mean, they were facing this existential
threat. So what did they do?
Well, they did what any smart ruler would do. They looked for allies, and they found one in the Portuguese.
Okay, so the Portuguese enter the picture.
Exactly. Now, the Portuguese, they had their own reasons for getting involved. They were obviously motivated by religious solidarity with the Christian Ethiopians, but they also had strategic interests in the Red Sea region.
So they saw an opportunity to kind of expand their own influence.
Yeah, pretty much.
Interesting. So the Portuguese arrive. How does this change the dynamics of the war?
Well, it changes things dramatically, because the Portuguese, they brought with them guns and cannons and all this advanced military technology that the Adalites just didn't have.
So they had a technological advantage.
Yeah, a big one. And at first, Ahmad Gure, he actually suffers some defeats against the Portuguese.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's a real setback for him. And he's forced to retreat. And he realizes that, he needs to up his game if he's going to compete with the Portuguese.
So what does he do?
Well, he turns to his Ottoman allies for help. And the Ottomans, they send reinforcements.
Nice.
Yeah, they said, Turkish musketeers, Albanian musketeers, Arab musketeers.
So he's getting some serious firepower now.
Yeah, he is. And with these reinforcements, Ahmad Garay, he launches this massive counteroffensive.
And how did that go?
Well, he manages to inflict some heavy losses on the Portuguese. He even personally kills their commander, Cristóvão da Gama, in a surprise attack on their encampment.
Wow, that's a huge victory.
It is, it is. But sadly for Ahmad Garay, it's kind of his last hurrah.
Oh, what happened?
Well, the final battle of the war takes place at Huayna Daga in 1543. And in this battle, Ahmad Garay, he's killed.
Oh, no.
Yeah, it's a devastating loss for Adal.
Right.
And it pretty much marks the end of their campaign against the Ethiopians.
Okay, so they lose their charismatic leader and the war kind of fizzles out.
Yeah, pretty much. The remaining Adal forces, they're routed. And the Ethiopian Empire, with the help of the Portuguese, they managed to secure victory.
So despite all their early successes, Adal ultimately loses the war. So what happens to them after that? Do they just disappear?
Well, no, not exactly. Despite their military defeat, the Adal Sultanate, it leaves behind this really rich legacy. And one of the most important aspects of that legacy is Harar, the city that we talked about earlier that became their capital.
Right.
So even after the war, Harar continues to thrive as this major center of Islamic learning and culture.
So they might have lost the war, but their cultural influence continues.
Exactly. And, the city itself it's a testament to that legacy. Harar has this incredible architecture, with its fortified walls, which were actually strengthened around 1550 by Emir Nur ibn Mujahid. And it has all these beautiful mosques and shrines and marketplaces.
So they left behind this physical reminder of their presence.
Yeah, absolutely. And beyond architecture, the Al Sultanate, it also had a lasting impact on the region's governance and legal systems. So they introduced Islamic legal systems, and they made some important administrative reforms that had an impact on how the region was governed for centuries afterwards.
So even in defeat, they left their mark.
They did. And we can't forget about their economic influence.
Right.
Even after the war, Adal, it remained a major player in the region's economy.
So how did they manage to do that?
Well, they controlled key trade routes.
Right. We talked about that earlier. Their strategic location.
Exactly. So they had control of the inland trade routes that connected the interior with coast. And they also controlled the crucial maritime routes along the Red Sea.
So they were basically in the perfect spot to control the flow of goods in and out of the region.
Exactly. And Xyla, their main port, it continued to be a really important trading hub.
So they never really lost that economic advantage.
No, they didn't. They were trading with, places all over Africa, the Middle East, and Asia.
Wow.
And they were trading in, high value goods like gold, ivory, and unfortunately slaves as well.
Yeah. The slave trade was a big part of the global economy at that time.
Sadly, it was.
So Xyla was basically like the economic engine of the Sultanate.
Yeah, you could say that. The historical records describe Xyla as this incredibly wealthy and prosperous city.
And what kind of stuff were they exporting?
Well, they exported all sorts of stuff.
Okay.
They had, grain, livestock, honey, wax, and they even had enough surplus to export agricultural products to other parts of Arabia.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, imagine that. A city in the Horn of Africa exporting food to Arabia.
That's pretty impressive.
It is. And it shows how productive their agricultural hinterland was. They had plenty of food
to go around, so they were economically secure.
Yeah, for a while. But like all empires, eventually it all started to decline.
Right. And what were the main factors that led to their downfall?
Well, there were a few things that kind of happened all at once.
Okay.
Firstly, after Ahmad Garay was killed, the Sultanate, it's kind of fell apart politically.
So they lost their strong central leadership. Okay.
And without that strong leader to hold everything together, local leaders, they started to assert their independence, and the Sultanate became more and more fragmented.
So they start to break apart from within.
Yeah, you could say that.
Okay.
And at the same time, you have the Ottomans starting to increase their influence in the coastal areas.
Right. The Ottomans are expanding their empire.
Exactly. And this put even more pressure on Adal.
Gotcha.
And then if that wasn't enough, you also had these massive migrations of the Oromo people starting in the mid-16th century.
Oh, right. The Ormo migrations. That was a huge demographic shift in the region.
It was the Oromo. They moved into former Adal territory, and this really weakened the Sultan. It stretched their resources thin, and it made it harder for them to settle territory.
So they're being squeezed from all sides.
Yeah, pretty much.
So what was the final nail in the coffin for Adal?
Well, after Emir Nur ibn Mujahid died in 1567, the Sultanate, it just kind of descended into chaos. There were these internal conflicts and power struggles, and they had some really disastrous military campaigns.
So they just couldn't get their act together.
No, they couldn't. And eventually, the Imamate of Ausa kind of emerged out of the wreckage.
Okay.
And that's generally seen as the official end of the Adal Sultan.
Okay. So they kind of fade out of existence.
Yeah, they do. But their legacy, it lives on, especially in the cultural and religious landscape of the Horn of Africa.
Right. We talked about that. Now, I'm curious about the people who made up the Adal Sultanate. What was their ethnic makeup? Was it pretty diverse, or were they mostly one group?
Yeah, no, it was actually incredibly diverse. Okay, so you had Somalis, Afars, Argaba people, Harares, all sorts of groups.
So a real melting pot of cultures.
Yeah, exactly. And each group played a role in the Sultanate's history.
Right.
For example, the Somalis, they were instrumental in the founding of Adal, and they played a huge role in the wars against the Ethiopians.
Okay.
And then you have the Harala people, and they were really important in the early days of the jihad. They provided a lot of leadership.
Interesting. So it wasn't just one group that dominated, it was a real coalition of different groups.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And we can even see this diversity reflected in the historical sources.
Oh, how so?
Well, for instance, Emperor Yeshak I, the Ethiopian emperor, he actually mentions the Simur in his victory poem.
Okay.
And the Simur, that's actually an old Harari term for the Somali people.
Oh, wow. So they were even recognized by their enemy as a significant part of the Adal Sultanate.
Yeah, exactly. And then you have Leo Africanus, who is famous traveler and writer.
Right.
And he actually provides some physical descriptions of the Adalites. He talks about their complexion and their clothing.
Interesting.
And he notes that there were some differences between the people who lived on the coast and those who lived inland, which kind of suggests, maybe some regional variations in culture or ethnicity.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, what about language? What languages were spoken in Adal?
Well, Arabic, that was kind of the lingua franca,
Okay.
especially for the ruling Walashma dynasty.
So that was the language of the elite.
Yeah, you could say that.
Okay.
But there's also some evidence that the aristocracy might have spoken a language that was similar to modern Harari.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And it's thought that Harari and Argaba, those languages, they kind of evolved in Harar during this period.
So the Adal Sultanate had a lasting impact on the linguistic landscape of the region.
Yeah, for sure.
Interesting. Now, let's talk about their military. You mentioned earlier that Ahmad Garay reformed the military. But what did the Adal military look like before those reforms?
Well, they had the usual divisions, infantry, cavalry.
Right.
But what's interesting is that they also had these distinct flags that symbolized the different branches of the military.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, it was a way of, showing their unit pride. And then Ahmad Garay, he comes along and he reorganizes everything.
Okay.
He creates these three main divisions, these really flexible units. So the first one is the Malisay, and these guys were the elite.
The special forces.
Yeah, you could say that. And they were often Herares, which is interesting.
So one particular ethnic group was kind of overrepresented in this elite unit.
Yeah, it seems that way.
Interesting.
And then you had the Somali wing, which was obviously made up of Somalis. And then the third wing, that was a mix of different groups.
Okay.
So you had Afars, Harala people, Harares, or Argaba people, all fighting together.
So a very diverse force.
Yeah, it was. And the Malisay, they were kind of like the central support unit. They would be deployed wherever they were needed most on the battlefield.
So they were like the Swiss Guard of the Adal Sultanate.
Yeah, that's a good analogy.
Now, what kind of armor and weapons did they use?
Well, the Adal soldiers, they wore a variety of armor, including helmets and chainmail. And the horsemen, they were also armored.
So they were pretty well protected.
They were okay. And in terms of weapons, they used swords, spears, bows and arrows. And of course, after Ahmad Garay's reforms, they started using firearms as well.
Right.
Now, one thing that's really interesting is that the sedentary agriculturalists of Harar, they played a huge role in the jihad.
So not just the nomadic pastoralists, but also the farmers.
Exactly. They provided a lot of the fighters, especially in the early days.
Wow.
And they also provided a lot of the leadership.
So they were really invested in this conflict.
Yeah, they were interesting.
And what about the Somalis? What was their contribution to the Adal military?
Oh, the Somalis were absolutely crucial.
Okay.
I mean, they provided huge numbers of troops, and they were known for their fierceness in battle. Several Somali clans, made significant contributions.
Like which ones?
So the Jerry, the Marahan, the Harti, the Haber Magali, the Deer clans, they were all involved.
So a real cross-section of Somali society.
Yeah, it was interesting.
Now, what about the Harari cavalry? We talked about them earlier.
Oh, yeah. They were a force to be reckoned with.
Okay.
They were Ahmad Garay's kind of shock troops. They were really well trained. They had these high-quality sabers that were imported from Zayla and Arabia. They were making fun faces in their movies, and they were indispensable.
Fancy.
Yeah, they were decked out nice. And they played a key role in a lot of Adal's victories, like, for example, the Battle of Shimbrakur.
So they were kind of like the hammer of the Adal army.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, from the rise of Adal to its fall.
We have.
But I'm curious, what tangible evidence is there of the Adal Sultanate's existence? Like, are there any ruins or artifacts that we can still see today?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, in the Awdal region of Somaliland, for example, there are lots of physical remains from the Awdal Sultanate period.
Okay.
Like near Borama, they found all these silver coins.
Cool.
Yeah. And these coins, they were actually minted by the Egyptian Burji Mamluk Sultan, Kite Bey.
Oh, wow. So that shows they had connections with Egypt.
Yeah, exactly. They were plugged into these wider trade networks.
Right.
And then there are also these ruins of large medieval cities in Somaliland.
And that wraps up our deep dive into the fascinating history of the Sultanates of Adal. From its legendary leaders to its epic battles, Adal's legacy still echoes today.
Absolutely. It was a powerhouse in the Horn of Africa, shaping trade, culture, and resistance against mighty empires. There's so much more to explore.
Thanks for tuning in. Don't forget to subscribe and share your thoughts.
Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring. History is always alive.